We want to keep students in classrooms that are functional, classrooms that are safe, classrooms that aren't bursting at the seams, classrooms where every student has an equitable shot at success because the supports are in place to make sure that happens. None of that will be possible if the Ford government does not change its plans.
Here in Ontario, another major teachers' union has voted to strike if they deem it necessary. The union representing the province's public high school teachers must give 5 days' notice if they intend to take that action. Catholic elementary and high school teachers also voted in favour of a strike, and public elementary teachers will start a Work to Rule campaign next week if they can't reach a contract deal with the provincial government. Today, Education Minister Stephen Lecce said a mediator should be brought to the negotiating table. What else is he prepared to do to avert job action? Stephen Lecce is the Ontario Minister of Education. He joins us now from Queen's Park in Toronto. Hi, Minister. Great to have you back on the show. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Have you been negotiating in good faith, or was this always the intention to bring in a mediator?
Yeah, I think both could be true. We have certainly been negotiating in good faith. We've demonstrated to the people of our province in Ontario that with the QP deal, with the education workers, we were able to get an agreement, a voluntary agreement with QP that was ratified overwhelmingly by their members by using similar approaches. In fact, with QP, we actually turned to a mediator to help us get to the finish line because there were some outstanding issues. I think the idea of a third party is simply driven by the overwhelming consensus by our government, which is we want to get a deal that keeps kids in class. And the mission of the government is to achieve that through a voluntary settlement. That is really the best option. It's the right option. And we hope that the unions will seriously consider it and join us at the mediation table so that we can land permanent deals, enduring deals that provide predictability for parents in Ontario.
So it appears that the unions on the other side of the table aren't taking you at your word. I want to read you some of the things that they've said today. The Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association president said, "Since this round of bargaining began, the government has been going out of its way to derail the process. They have made comments to the media that have had a detrimental effect on negotiations, introduced regulations and legislations that violate our collective bargaining rights, and played games with the public to muddy the issue and deflect blame." Do they have a point?
You know what? I obviously appreciate that the unions will drive a counter narrative to the other parties at the table. I mean, I think what is consistent is what we've seen across all the teacher unions specifically is escalation tactics or approaches being utilized. In this case, a narrative is being thrown out. And the fact is, I think for parents at home, they actually don't really materially care about the back and forth and the finger pointing. They want deals. And I think the mission of the mediation today, not to be evasive of Ashley, but the fact is, we can talk about the process, but at the end of the day, what is the measurement of the success of this government and of the parties? It's getting a deal. And so if we can look at mediation as a viable tool that can ultimately get a voluntary settlement, then it's mildly flabbergasting because I think it is the best option. It's an independent option, and it worked for QP. It worked like literally a month ago. So my hope is to replicate that outcome because I think parents should not be in the cyclical reality of every 3 years in the province of Ontario facing instability. And on that Sunday night, as you may recall, that famous Sunday night before we got the deal with QP, that deadline bargaining was not particularly helpful for families who were scrambling for childcare. And I think that's really unfair. So my hope is a mediator can expedite the process, drive a deal, get us to the finish line, and at the end of the day, provide predictability not just for families and for the kids, but even for the educators too, who overwhelmingly seem to want to work. And I think they do, and I want to keep them in class.
Minister, though, how is it good faith to pass legislation that caps the increases for wage increases, rather, for the public sector at 1% before you even sign a deal?
Well, with respect to Bill 124, the fact of the matter is we got a voluntary settlement with QP while that bill was before the House. It did not impinge in any way or undermine the ability of that union, an education sector union, from not only agreeing tentatively with the government and then ratifying it overwhelmingly. So I think that argument is somewhat negated by the fact that QP has already accepted that premise. And so we hope the bill seeks an aspirational target or a target of 1% for benefits. And for salary, the unions are requesting 2%. Sector-wide, Vashi, just for context, for all teacher tables, that's $1.5 billion. Now, I'm not disputing teachers work hard. These are people in my family who I know care deeply about our kids. The issue is, where do we put resources in a period of finite resources? And I'm saying...
But you have deemed those... Sorry to interrupt, but you have deemed those resources finite. Your government has made the decision that that's where you're going to cap things, that you won't move to the 2% because you don't want to put resources there. Is that not true?
Well, yeah. I think what we're signaling is for the people of Ontario is that we were prepared to put 1% every year for the life of the contract. However, any ancillary increases, if I have to put more money into the system, it ought to go to help kids, not to expand entitlements or not to expand salaries. And all I'm simply saying is,
I would expect that parents hope that the teachers of their kids, though, are paid well for what they do. They don't have easy jobs.
Indeed, and I think teacher salaries in Ontario are the second highest in the country. They're well remunerated, and we appreciate and value their contribution to education in the province. It's consequential to our future prosperity. All I'm simply saying is the unions are saying that we ought to be putting in 2%. Or in and around that, or sometimes even more for COLA, which could exceed it based on economic growth. And I'm saying 2-3%, we ought to be expending more money in the front line. With CUPE, we actually achieved 1% on benefits, on salary, and concurrently achieved a win-win outcome on more investments for more workers that support kids with exceptionalities. That's a deal I like to replicate. We achieved that target on salary, which is good for taxpayers, I would argue, and ultimately good for the sector, but we also achieved more support. More of those additional dollars, quote unquote, are now being front-end loaded into the classroom to help kids, particularly with special education needs. That's what I think parents want, and that's what I'm fighting for at the table.
Just so that I'm clear, though, is it the government's position that you will not move from that 1% figure, given the legislation, given the position that you've asserted? Is that something that is, not up for bargain?
Yeah, look, we've been clear. We want to maintain the 1% over the course of the legislation, over the course of the life of that term, of that contract. Look, every table is different, and we treat it with a unique element. But the fact is, we think there's a pathway to get a deal at 1%, knowing that we can continue to make critical investments in the front lines. And just to your earlier point about sort of the finite resources, let's not forget, in our fall economic statement that the Minister of Finance, Rod Phillips, announced a couple weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, we announced an additional $200 million net expenditure in public education. It's the highest amount ever announced in the history of Ontario. I mean, more than the education premier of Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne, we're spending more year over year. We are on track.
You're actually only spending year over year. The increase is only 1.2% over the next 3 years. And many have argued that that's less than half what's needed to match inflation and population growth.
We have added a $500 million allocation for new schools after the former Liberal government closed 600, the largest and the biggest closure policy in the history of Ontario under one government. We're building new schools, a $500 million investment, $200 million to improve math after the failed Discovery Math ideological approach from a pedagogical perspective teaching math. We're returning back to basics, and I'm revising the math curriculum that will be done this spring and implemented next September. I think quite honestly,
I take it that you're making investments, but it's not a spending spree. Like, let's be clear.
No, I'm not submitting it's a spending spree. What I'm submitting, it's the highest expenditure ever. In our first budget, it was the highest. We've now expanded it by another $200 million. What it shows culturally is we're prepared to invest in the frontline services, Vashi, while concurrently keeping taxes low and returning to balance, which is a prudent plan for economic growth while ensuring we protect the social services that are important for aging families, for young families with kids, for all of us who I think need to know that this progressive Conservative government is going to protect social services now and well into the future. It's about sustainability of these programs, and that's why we've made the reforms we've made. It's why we're making the investments we're making, even in mental health. I mean, this week is anti-bullying week. It'd be prudent for me to at least mention that just a few weeks ago at CAMH, which is a Centre for Mental Health and Addiction in Toronto, we announced that this government, a progressive Conservative government under Premier Doug Ford, more than doubled mental health investment. That is a compassionate eye when it comes to improving the services for our kids, particularly vulnerable kids. And I think it was an important step forward to help those children in need.
Again, I would just point out, though, that your year-over-year spending and your projected spending over the next 3 years, many say is not enough to match population growth. I take your point that your government is spending more than, for example, that it did in the last budget, where it was criticized for a number of the cuts that were made. But if you look at spending growth, I know it's one of the big parts of the budget, but if you look at spending growth, it isn't a spending spree.
Yeah, according to the public accounts, this year, we're on track to expend more than $1.2 billion more than we did last year. I think we are spending more, and I think in the fall economic statement, we've made an incremental step forward by an additional $200 million. It's not the end of the journey. It's really the beginning. We're in really the first year and a half, but I think you're going to consistently see in future budgets a continued investment in the defense of education and public education, because we know how critical it is for the prosperity of our province. We want young people to be able to get the tools they need to succeed in a global job market. And the fact is, in this country, we have twice the youth unemployment rate. And yet we have a 29-year unemployment, we have a 29-year low in unemployment in Ontario, thanks to the economic leadership of this government. We've created over 200,000 net new jobs, private sector overwhelmingly full-time, and yet young people can't get a decent job related to their skills. So we have to do more. Part of it is investment, Vashi, but part of it is actually aligning our curriculum that doesn't require investment per se. It requires a labor market lens on what we're teaching our kids. And we're not giving the financial
I'm just
literacy.
asking you about the finances, obviously, because of the negotiations that are underway right now.
Yes.
Okay, and I have to leave it there. Thank you, Minister Lecce. I'm out of time. I appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you.
Always. Today, Ontario Education Minister Stephen Lecce, as you heard there, said a mediator should be brought into the negotiating table. What would the opposition do to break the bargaining deadlock? NDP education critic Merrick Stiles joins us now from Toronto. Hi, Ms. Stiles. Great to see you. Thanks for making time for us.
It's my pleasure.
Let me get your take first on the call for mediation. You heard Minister Lecce there say it's probably the best way forward in order to reach a deal with various unions. Do you agree with them calling on a mediator?
Well, look, I mean, the parties will have to decide that, and that is for both parties to decide. But I thought what was really perplexing about what the minister did this morning when he announced publicly in a press conference that he was suggesting mediation is he didn't talk to the unions. He didn't talk to the education workers, which is an unusual way to conduct bargaining. But it's also pretty consistent with the way that this government has been operating since they were pretty much elected, which is to basically pick a fight with education workers in this province.
How do you think that they're picking a fight? How do you know that?
Well, we've had over the last year, Mr. Ford, the Premier, make a number of calls. For example, he called education workers union thugs. He accused education workers of pushing students to protest at schools. Students themselves were feeling pretty unhappy about the government's cuts and were well within their power to walk out themselves. So this has been actually a fight that the Premier has been picking with Ontario's education workers. And I think where we are today is in large part a result of that, and also the government's significant cuts to education.
I mean, they were able to reach a deal with education workers. Minister Lecce was able to achieve that. They insist that this isn't about picking a fight, and that's why they're calling on a mediator.
Yes, well, there's a really easy way for the government to actually solve this problem. The big issue seems to be the cuts to education. We are seeing this government in Ontario eliminate 10,000 teaching positions over the next 3 years. We're already feeling
sorry to interrupt,
the
but isn't that the assessment if they increase the cap on class sizes to 28? They have now said that they might go to 25, right? Which would be, now the unions say that's about 5,000 positions.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's something that they've apparently, according to the minister, put on the table. But we haven't seen them actually backtrack on their policy. I've asked the minister repeatedly.
Fair point, yeah.
And so at this point, a 28 average is really looking like right now in year one, classes of 40 plus in many of our high schools, students losing courses that they need to graduate, like even classes that they're going to need to pursue post-secondary education. It's devastating, and it's going to get worse. And this government needs to do the right thing, back away from that, and then get back to the table and make a deal.
The ministers, though, pointed out that they're spending $1.2 billion more on education for this school year versus the last one. The Outlook announced an additional $186 million on education this year. That's all within the confines of a $9 billion deficit. They could have cut more if they wanted, but they didn't.
This is actually a game that the minister's playing here with the numbers. The increase in education spending is actually due to the fact that they've thrown in a child care tax credit in there. They've actually included a fund they're using, an attrition fund, which is there actually to eliminate teachers from our schools. So it's kind of poor math on the part of the minister. And really, ultimately, what we've seen, and the financial accountability officer here has said this independently, that the government is actually making a cut to education. And again, 10,000 fewer teaching positions, that's 10,000 fewer caring adults in our high schools. It's going to be devastating.
If in fact it is 10,000, though, I just want to add a cautionary note that we don't have those final numbers yet. Yes, that's the position the union asserted when the class sizes were looking like they were going to be 28. If in fact that position does change through these negotiations, it won't be that many.
Well, the Financial Accountability Office says the current government policy will result. It's actually the Financial Accountability Office that's confirmed that the numbers are 10,000 teaching positions. So
for sure, but if their policy changes, then
absolutely they can negotiate something with the unions. What we're saying is, just let's start from the premise of we don't want to cut education. Let's start there, and let's go back to having classes where our students get the attention they need, get the support they need. Stop your plan to move to 4 mandatory online courses here in Ontario. You know, just back off of that, and let's actually get to the table and make sure that our students stay in class.
Is it also about compensation? I know there's been a lot of discussion in the legislature, for example, about the government and their legislation to cap public sector wages at 1%. I asked the minister earlier if that impacted his ability to bargain in good faith, and he insisted that it hadn't affected, the bill had already been introduced when they were negotiating with CUPE, so it hadn't affected those negotiations, and also that and I want to read exactly what he said actually, that he would rather give a modest increase and then put the rest of the funding into frontline resources that benefit students directly. Does he have a point there?
You know, the minister and the Ford government put in a wage restraint bill in the spring, just as they were starting negotiations. So they set a certain tone with the education workers, which I think was actually very unhelpful. And if you look at what happened with the CUPE workers, I think if you were to ask the education workers who got a deal right at the edge of the federal election, I'm not sure they would feel quite as happy about that as the minister has said. Look, it's pretty clear that what the education workers in this province are fighting for is what Ontario families are fighting for. It's what students are asking for, which is that the government needs to back away from these really significant cuts to education. There's no other way to look at it.
But does he have an argument there, pardon the interruption, but does he have an argument there that he would rather keep those increases to salaries and benefits modest while investing in other areas that are more directly to students?
Well, look, you know, that's an issue that the education workers and the government are going to have to decide at the bargaining table. But I don't think we would be in the position that we are in today, and the education workers have been very clear about this. We would not be where we are today if he wasn't actually at the same time making significant cuts to schools. And also, by the way, again, forcing our students in Ontario to take 4 of their credits in high school online. There is no other jurisdiction that has done that. In fact, when I asked the minister to give me some examples, he cited Alabama. We should not be following in the footsteps of Alabama, which has one of the worst records in education in the United States. This is not the right direction. This is not where Ontario students or families want us to be headed. And the minister knows that. He knows what the right path is here. So I think that is the issue that they're dealing with at the bargaining table.
All right, I'm out of time. I have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Merritt Stiles. Really appreciate your time this evening.
Thanks so much.
Ontario's NDP education critic, Merritt Stiles from Toronto. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.